the next member of the panel is Dr. Thomas Stolz. Thomas Stolz is also a longtime friend, especially in the struggle for understanding small languages. Dr. Stolz is full professor of general and comparative linguistics at the University of Bremen in Germany. He has conducted a number of projects focusing on aspects of Chamorro grammar and Chamorro language context. He's visited the Marianas in 2007, 2011, and 2018. In the framework of the project Chamorrica, several unpublished Chamorro texts are being prepared for a critical edition. He's also interested, and this is, I think, the focus of his presentation today, in the reconstruction of place names of the Gani Islands. And I'll let him explain what are the Gani Islands. I think it's familiar to most people, but maybe not all. So Dr. Stolz, are you still with us?
Yes, I am. Do you hear me?
I can hear you. We can hear you fine. So
okay.
Thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, there should be a PowerPoint presentation. So I hope you can see it. I can see nothing at the moment. Yeah, there is it. Yeah, fine. That's the PowerPoint presentation I will use for my talk today. There are lamentably too many slides to spend a lot of time on each of them. So we have to rush through part of the presentation, but I think you know many things that I'm going to tell you already. So it's no need for us to dwell for a long time on certain aspects. There's the more important aspects come later in the presentation. So first of all, of course, I have to thank you that we are admitted on the program of this conference. We are very happy about it. And when I say we, I'm talking about 3 people. I'm just the representative of this group, and I will tell you about the group in a tick. So next slide, please. Yeah. Okay, that's the table of contents. There's already the introduction. Then I will make some general remarks on place names in the Marianas in the first part. That is the part you know about fine. Then the situation in the Gani Islands, of course. Then there will be a counterexample from the North Atlantic. We have heard about the Atlantic already and what is there with in connection with place names. And then in the final part, the last bit of this talk will be on a project to be that we can perhaps conduct together. So next slide, please. We are 3 linguists from Germany, and of course we are outsiders. We don't know everything about your islands, your culture, and your history. So we, in a way, we want to learn from your expertise. The group of 3 consists of Dr. Nataliya Levkovych. She's my assistant professor, myself, and my colleague from the interdisciplinary linguistics, Professor Dr. Ingo H. Warnke. And we have been involved in a number of projects dedicated to place names. Different projects, sometimes it's just grammar of place names, and in other cases, it's the history of place names. And we are especially interested in the colonial heritage of place names, so the Europeanization of the world map through colonialism. So you know, when European colonial powers came to the Americas, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific regions, they sometimes renamed places or founded new places and used European-like names. And we want to inventorize these names and see what history is behind these names and what happens to these names in post-colonial countries, for instance. So that's a very interesting, also political issue, of course. This is, of course, only one reason why we are interested in the place names in the Marianas. Next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know where the Gani Islands are, they are north of Saipan. The islands, they're in the blue circle. you see on the map are called also Gani or Gani Islands. And I will come back to the Gani Islands also in a couple of minutes. First, we go to the better known part of the Northern Marianas to the south of the red line on the map. Next slide, please. So there are place names in the Marianas. I'm also talking about the early 20th century. There are still Spanish names, Santa Rosa. There are partly Japanese names of Pagan, for instance, partly German names. There were only very few German-looking names. Muchuk is there on a German map of Saipan. Chamorro names, of course, Carolinian names, and English names as well. So meaning English of English origin, of course, created with material from the English language. Next slide. So there is a plethora of names of different origin in the islands, and this is already interesting for people who study place names or names in general. Onomasticians or toponomasticians are interested in place names. There is a singularity just to find a connection between Germany and the Marianas. In a book published by Scott Russell, you can read this paragraph: the village of Tanapak, completely leveled by strong winds and high seas, was re-established on a protected hillside opposite the harbor. The Germans named the settlement Neuheim, New Town, although the residents continue to refer to it by its traditional name, Puerto Rico. So the Germans weren't very successful in creating new names on the maps of the islands. There's just this Neuheim and then this Muchukuk, for instance, very little German traces left on the maps of the Marianas, and also during the German times in the Northern Marianas, nothing much happened on the maps. Next slide, please. This is perhaps interesting for outsiders, people who are not familiar with the history of the Mariana Islands and its people. So you see there are this multitude of names on the maps, sometimes historical names, but also names you find on modern maps, all of them referring to the islands as a group, the archipelago of the Marianas, for instance. Tanotasi you find, Islas de los Ladrones, Islas de las Belas Latinas, Islas de los Jardines, Islas de los Placeres, or Las Placeres, and Archipelago de San Lázaro, and Islas Marianas. So that's what you can find. And there are also German versions when Marianas is written with two N consonants. Next slide, please. So this is perhaps interesting. So there are some noises, no?
Yeah.
Though there is parallel terminology, of course, from the north going down south on the map of the Mariana Islands. Of course, during the Spanish times, there were Spanish names. Some of them have persisted into the modern age. There are the Austronesian names and Chamorro names, Carolinian names for the islands. You find the Spanish names, for instance, also still on maps of the German administration in the early 20th century. So when the German administration just started to chart the islands. So let's go to the next slide, please. You find also contemporary Spanish place names on Saipan, just to show it to you what is interesting for people who want to know about what the colonizers left on the map of their former colonies. So you find these Spanish names you can find practically everywhere in the former Spanish Empire. So in the successor states from Mexico down to Argentina, you find places called San Jose, San Antonio, San Vicente, San Roque, and so on. So a lot of santos are there. So you find these saintly names almost everywhere in the Spanish-speaking world or in the formerly Spanish-speaking world. So next slide, please. So now the special case of the Gani Islands. Everything I told you up until now is of course known to you, and perhaps some things about the Gani Islands are not so widely or commonly known among people even on the Mariana Islands. On the 4 southerly islands of the Commonwealth, there is a rich stock of place names, also of course on Guam, which refer to geo-objects on the islands, hills, valleys, lakes, rivulets, and so on. In contrast, the situation changes dramatically if we look at the 10 islands to the north of Saipan. At least superficially, and with the exception of Pagan, only the names of the islands themselves seem to exist. Individual geo-objects on these islands are not registered by name in the extant sources. This is striking because 4 of the islands used to be settled on and off during the last 100 years. Next slide, please. So there's a book from the early 1970s where there was still the trust territory of the Pacific Islands. And this was a compilation of all the place names in the US trust territory. And you see there is a page there on the slide covering the Marianas north of the Saipan in the blue box. Sorry for my voice. And you see there is also a little bit demographic statistics there with a lot of zeros, but also some other numbers. Please, next slide. Next slide, if it is possible. Yeah, okay. So in this book, everything that is named on the islands is also registered. And if you look at these cases, Agrihan, Asuncion, and so on, what you find are only the names of the islands themselves. There is Asuncion in MI3 here. Asuncion, it says Asongson, Asomsom, Asongson. These are orthographic varieties of the name. So there are variants of the name, quite a few, and you find them for practically all of the islands, but there is not a single object on the islands identified by a place name. So next slide, please. So this is different with Pagan because you find there are localities on Pagan. They are listed there, and there's Togari Rock, Apasantate, Maru Mountain, and so on. Names like that are missing from the maps of the other islands. Next slide, please. So this is our further islands of the Gani group, and you find the same situation there. There is just the island name and the synonyms of the island name, so alternative names for the island, but no name for an object on the islands. So next slide, please. So yet now you can have a look at the maps themselves. So there are official maps of these islands, the Gani Islands, published starting from the 1960s and then finally published in the 1986 by US government offices. The US Department of Agriculture was responsible together with the US Defense Mapping Agency and so on. So these are really official maps, and now we have a look at the maps for each island individually. So next you find a picture of Farallon de Medinilla, and of course the map on the right side, and there is just the name of the island and nothing, no bay, no beach, no let's say hill or whatever has a separate individual name. Next slide. So there is some information about the island. It says that it was probably inhabited at the time of the Spanish conquest. So it is said so in the history of the Catholic mission in the islands in the second half of the 17th century, but nothing very detailed is known about the population. But in the 20th century, the population was nil. Next slide, please. Anatahan is the same situation, nice picture, there is a volcano and so on, but there is no name to the volcano, and on the map you find nothing except the word village somewhere, and it will be the topic of a later slide then. Next slide, please. Again, there is a little bit population statistics in San Vitores report on the mission. It says in 1668 it was densely populated, but then in the 20th century the population was not really densely. So from 10 in 1900 to a peak to 80 inhabitants in the 1930s. After the war, of course, 0, and then again repopulated, but it never, the population never reached the old peak again. But still, it was populated, it was inhabited by people, so people lived there. Next slide, please. Sarigan, again, the situation, there is an empty map, although the island is clearly topographically speaking very diverse, so there would be reason to name parts of the island to identify them, but there is nothing on the map, as you see. Next slide, please. Again, in the Spanish history, it says that by 1695, inhabitants were deported to Saipan and later on to Guam. So that means it was inhabited when the Spaniards arrived. In the 20th century, there are just very minimal groups of inhabitants early in the 20th century. And then in the 1960s, again, 3 people living there, but still people were there on the islands. Next slide, please. Guguan, again, also an island whose map is without further names except the island name. And next slide, please. So San Vitore speaks of settlements in the southern part of the island as of 1669, but in the 20th century there was no population registered for Guguan. Alamagan on the next slide, please, is a similar situation. There's again the word village on the map, but that's all. Although you see the coastline is interesting, for on any other island on the world, you would find names for the beaches or the bays or the cliffs and so on, but there is nothing on the map. So next slide, please. This is interesting because the island was inhabited not only in the distant past, but also throughout the 20th century, except for the 1945 period. That's perhaps very interesting because there is also a kind of permanent or continuous population on the islands throughout the 20th century. Now we come to Pergen. That's the one exception. That's the only map of the Gani Islands where you find names for objects on the islands. Next slide, please. It was densely populated when the Spaniards arrived. Then there was the deportation again. And in the 20th century, it was the most densely populated island of the Gani group. Again, a peak in the early 20th century, about 140 people perhaps living there, and later on also a Japanese population. Next slide. There are some Japanese relics in the on the map, some Japanese names, Shomushon mountains, which are partly Japanese, English plus Japanese again, and rocks again. So there could be names on the maps. Next slide. This is Agrihan. You see there is just the name, and then again there is a village on the map. But that's it. And we go to the next slide. we see the island was populated throughout the 20th century, except immediately after the end of the Second World War. It was populated early on when the Spaniards arrived. Next slide. Asunción. Again, there's just the name of the island on the map. Next slide, please. It says that it was inhabited when the Spaniards were there, but we don't know about villages or so on. And in the 20th century, there was no population, permanent population on the island. Next slide. We're nearing the end, by the way, of the slideshow. There's Smaug, and you know there's 3 separate islands in a way. No names for the separate islands here on the map, and no names for objects on the island. Let's go to the next slide. You see it in the Spanish report of the mission period. It was supposed to be inhabited. People were deported later on, and in the 20th century, there were no permanent inhabitants on the islands. And then there's Urraques. It's on the next page. Again, there's the volcano and so on. There's the alternative Spanish-like name of the island, Farallón de Pájaros. Next slide. It's possible that Urraques was probably never permanently settled, so we don't know about that. Now we have finished this slideshow of the islands. Now again on the changeful history, starting with the end of the Spanish occupation or conquest of the islands. There was the deportation of all inhabitants of the Gani Islands to Saipan. In just a few years later, the deportation from there to Guam. Then in the early 19th century, the immigration of Carolinians to Saipan. 1863, the resettlement of Tinian. 1899, the northwards migration or back migration from Guam. At the beginning of the 20th century, resettlement of 4 islands. Then 1905, immigration of Carolinians to Pagan and Saipan, encouraged by the German administration. Then in 1911, resettlement of other islands in the Gani group. Then in 1935, settlements were reported only for Agrihan, Pagan, Alamagan, and Anatahan. 1945, all of the Gani Islands were depopulated. 1970, settlements were reported only for Agrihan, Pagan, Alamagan, and Anatahan, meaning permanent settlements, of course. Then in the 1980s, the start of the evacuation of the inhabitants of the Gani Islands to Saipan and Tinian. And as far as we know, about 2018, no permanent human presence on the Gani Islands. So next slide, please. There is the big question, where are the place names? Except Pagan, the maps of the Gani Islands do not bear any names for geo-objects on the islands. Hills, valleys, rocks, beaches, lakes, etc. remain anonymous in a manner of speaking. This is remarkable insofar as people have lived there for more or less extended periods of time. They were involved in agriculture, raised cattle, and were fishermen. Children were born there, and in some places, as far as we know, they could also attend school, go to church, and bury their dead. We assume that everyday life required of people to orient themselves spatially in their surroundings. This necessity provides the precondition for the creation and use of place names. If you want to orient yourself in space, yeah, it's easy to orient yourself if you put names to permanent objects. So next slide, please. There's a press release because we went to Saipan 2 years ago. And I don't want to read it out to you because perhaps some of you know it, but we have become interested in the absence of names on these maps and had the idea that it is perhaps a good idea to try to reconstruct the place names of these islands. We know that people who lived on these islands are still around and may be ready to share their memories with us. So next slide. Next slide. So there is Scott Russell, who invited us to come to Saipan for this project. He himself was interested in the place names, and he had collected place names from available sources, mostly administrative texts, travel logs, and unpublished manuscripts of the 1970s. And his search yielded a list of 33 place names, and only 8 of which can be attributed with some, but not with absolute certainty, to a given geo-object. So we have names, but can't put them to attach them to a given object. We know there is this name, but what is the object? We have objects without names, and we have names without objects in a way. We assume that there must be many more place names stored in the memory of the former inhabitants of the Gani Islands. So now on the next slide, you see the list Scott Russell drew up. We don't go through it. I just tell you we know on which island the object must be placed. There was a place, some object named Arctic Ocean, and it wasn't the Arctic Ocean, of course. It was a place on the island of Anatahan. Whatever it was, it mustn't be, it's not necessarily a village or a settled place. It could be any kind of geo-object. And you find Aspeligro, Banco, Malas, Partido, Quiroga, Regusa, and so on. And most of the time, we can't really tell what the name was used for. So next slide, please. So the highest degree of confidence with these place names collected by Scott Russell is with the recurring name Song Song. It is there 4 times in the list. For the islands Alamagan, Anatahan, and Agrihan, it is relatively easy to locate the place called Song Song on the map. And it's different in the case of Sarigan. It is acknowledged that there was a settlement Song Song on Sarigan. However, the exact geographical location of the village is still unknown, at least to us. Next slide, please. You see 2 islands, Alamagan and Anatahan, and the red dots on the islands indicate the place where Song Song is to be located. The same with on the next slide, Agrihan and Sarigan. You find these red dots there again. Now, there's a problem, of course. In Chamorro, Song Song is ambiguous as the word class it belongs to. It can be a common noun, meaning village. And thus, in this function, it can refer to any village, also to the village I'm living here in Germany. It may be used to refer to any kind of settlement which fulfills the criteria of being a village. At the same time, Song Song is also a place name with specific reference, mono-reference, we call it, as in the case of Song Song on Rota, for instance. This is a special place called Song Song. Whether the name of the island Song Song is related to the place name usage of Song Song or a folk etymological reanalysis of Spanish Asunción or vice versa cannot be determined in this talk. Honestly, I don't know. So next slide. The absence of place names for geo-objects on the Gani Islands is special. It's really special. There are many uninhabited islands in different parts of the world whose maps nevertheless host a plethora of place names, although they are of no practical use to anybody in terms of everyday communicative necessities, because there is nobody who has the need to orient him or herself on the islands. There is thus no tight causal relation between permanent human presence and the existence of place names. Humans don't have to be there for place names to be there. some humans must have been there once. That's enough in a way. So the next slide. So this is now a contrastive case. Jan Mayen is a Norwegian island in the North Atlantic. It was discovered in the early 17th century and never populated at any time because the climatic conditions are disfavorable to long-term human settlements. Too cold, yeah, you know. Whalers used to stop by for short periods of time. The absence of humans on the island notwithstanding, the geo-objects on the islands have been systematically named so that the extant maps of Jan Mayen are almost overcrowded with place names. So have a look at the next slide, for instance. So you see part of the island, and you see there are words printed on the island. So these are place names for objects on the island. Please, next slide. We zoom in on part of the island. You can recognize some of the names there. And on the next slide, I read out a selection for you. There is Kronprinsesse Mertasbre, that's a glacier, Crown Princess Mertas glacier. Krognesryggen, that's a mountain range named after a person named Krognes, Krognes' back. Trinity Berget, the mountain, Mount Trinity. Trinity was the name of a ship. Håkon Top, that meaning Håkon the seventh peak. Nordkap, North Cape. Koksletta, and these are down Coke Downs. Skansen, there's a hill fortification. Krossbukta, a bay. Crosses Bay, named after a person. Varta Hill, Wart. And Trollstien, mountain ranges, Trollstairs, and so on. You find hundreds of names on the island. As you see here, there is a book, a whole monograph dedicated to the place names of Jan Mayen. This is about 150 pages of place names. So next slide, please. So there's no reason for leaving the maps empty. Jan Mayen is a counterexample in the sense that it shows that geo-objects may bear names even without the permanent presence of users of these place names. On this Norwegian island, even those geo-objects which are physically out of reach of humans have been baptized, the glaciers, for instance. In contrast to Jan Mayen, the Gani Islands were repeatedly inhabited throughout their history. The topographic structure of the Gani Islands is by no means monotonous. There are sufficiently prominent geo-objects along the coast and in the hinterland which seem to be waiting for being named. Please, next slide. That's our project proposal. Given that we are facing remembered but still unregistered place names, we fear that an important component of the cultural heritage of the Marianas is in danger of falling into oblivion. To safeguard the knowledge of the former inhabitants of the Gani Islands to the benefit of the future generations, an effort should be made to recover the presumably rich stock of place names and document them in the format of an annotated and culturally well-informed atlas. Next slide. So what we can offer is our assistance in terms of linguistic and toponomastic expertise to lend a helping hand to those who are willing to attempt to reconstruct the missing place names. The decisions what to accept as a place names is of course yours. It's not ours. So we can just comment on things and advise, that's all. We have initiated the collaboration with Leo Pangelinan at the council, and it is hoped that former inhabitants of the Gani Islands share their memories with the project team, because without their support of the former inhabitants, the atlas will not be feasible in the first place. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Stolz. This was a very interesting presentation. We're a little kind of out of time, but it inspired a lot of conversation, and a lot of knowledge was being shared while you were talking. The people who knew people who lived in Pagan and other places and started to remember names, and extended interview, I think, conducted by Noel Kitagwa will also be very interesting. And so we urge everyone who has direct knowledge of this. Just to clarify, Gani means in Chamorro like to run aground. So for whatever reason, Gani was used to refer to these islands north. Maybe they got them all and they got them all to run aground first in Saipan and then eventually to run aground in Guam. And the historical record seems to indicate that in the resettlement of Guam, these Gani Islanders were actually resettled in the southern part of Guam, which may account for a dialectical difference in Chamorro, which was kind of like unknown for centuries as to why the dialect of Chamorro on Rota would be similar to a dialect of Chamorro in southern Guam, especially Omatak. So there may have been historical resettlement reasons for that, as well as other things that people have noticed, like, you know, size and body types and all kinds of things that are related to it. So it's very rich topic. And so, you know, and of course, the names on Saipan, you know, there are some place names there that are actually repeat place names from Guam. I think they have a Mangilao, and they also have a Talafofo, which is kind of more a geographical description rather than an actual place names. And of course, there's lots of place names in Guam that have no particular meaning, or people have lost it, or they're named after people. And so that seems to be absent in almost, you know, like, you know, if we were to name a place on Pagan after you, Dr. Stolz, will call it a Stolz. This is a Stolz right here.
Don't do it. Don't do
it. And so, you know, so the floor is open for all that rich conversation.